The morning they backed that trailer up to my east gate, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2019, and the fog was sitting so low on the pasture you could lose a fence post in it past 30 yards. I remember the temperature was 31 degrees at the gate latch because I'd checked it twice before I walked out, and my breath was coming in small white clouds that the fog just swallowed up whole. I had 41 acres behind that gate, most of it rough pasture that hadn't seen a mower since July, and what came off that trailer that morning was 240 spent laying hens. White leghorns mostly, with a handful of production reds mixed in, and every one of them had the look of a bird that had been asked for everything and given nothing back in a long while. Pale combs, narrow keels, that particular thinness around the breast that a laying operation produces in a hen the way hard debt produces it in a man. The fellow driving the trailer was a barn manager from a mid-size egg operation about 40 miles east of here. I'll call him the barn boss because that is what he was. He had 3 barns of 40,000 birds each, and these 240 were his spent flock from barn number 1, pulled out ahead of the new pullets coming in the following week. He had called me on a Thursday, said he had a load he needed gone, and asked if I wanted them for the cost of diesel to bring them. I told him I did. He drove them over that Tuesday morning and backed the trailer to my east gate, and we got them into the pasture without much ceremony, and before he had his gloves back off, he looked out over those birds fanning into the fog, and he said what I imagine any reasonable man in his position would say. He said they're renderer trash. He wasn't being cruel. He was being accurate by every standard his industry runs on. A spent commercial layer at the end of her cycle is worth roughly the cost of transport to the rendering plant, which is to say, she is worth almost nothing, and sometimes less than nothing when you account for the hauling. They don't carry weight. They don't marble. They've been bred for one thing and one thing only, and when that one thing is done, they are a liability on a feed bill. He said, "I hope you know what you've got here." I told him I appreciated the load. He drove back east into the fog, and I stood at my gate and looked out at 240 hens picking at November pasture, and I thought about my grandfather's notebook for the first time in probably 4 years. I want to be honest about my reasons because they weren't romantic. I hadn't bought a dream. I'd bought, or rather accepted, at no cost plus $40 in my pocket to cover a case of water and a tank of gate hardware I'd had to run for, 240 birds that the whole receiving end of the poultry industry had already written a number on, and the number was 0. What I knew, or thought I knew, was that the number was wrong. Not by much, maybe, but wrong in a direction that mattered to me, which was the direction of a small farmer's market 32 miles west of my gate that ran every Saturday from April through December, and a customer base that had been asking me, politely, and then with increasing frequency, whether I was ever going to have a stewing hen they could buy. I had been raising meat birds for that market for going on 11 years at that point. Broilers mostly, with a few ducks and some turkeys around the holidays. I knew those customers. I knew what they cooked. And what they kept coming back to ask about was a stewing hen, a real one, the kind their grandmothers had used, and I had kept not having one for them because the honest answer was that I had never been sure the numbers would hold. A broiler you raise in 8 to 10 weeks, and you sell it, and the math is straightforward enough. A laying hen is somebody else's 8 months of infrastructure and feed before she ever gets to you. And by the time she arrives, she looks like the kind of bird that makes a person uncertain. That uncertainty was the thing I had postponed. I'll own that. I had let 4 years go by since I had first thought seriously about spent hens, and I had put the notebook back on the shelf each of those 4 years, and I had kept selling broilers and not having a stewing hen for the people who asked. And then the barn boss called on that Thursday, and the fog came in on that Tuesday, and 240 birds walked off a trailer and out into my rough pasture and started working at the November ground like they had been waiting for precisely that kind of ground all their lives, and I thought, all right, we'll find out what we've got here. My grandfather farmed this ground before my father did, and my father farmed it before me, and between the two of them they left me three things of real value. They left me the land itself, which is 41 acres of bottom ground and slope that I have described in other places and won't belabor here. They left me a way of reading weather that I couldn't teach you in a classroom if I had to, because it isn't words. It's a set of physical responses to pressure and light, and the smell of the air that I absorbed somewhere between age 6 and age 12, and that I couldn't take apart and explain to you any more than I could explain how I balance on 2 feet. And they left me a notebook. My grandfather's notebook was a marbled composition book, the kind you could buy at any 5 and dime in 1951, with a black and white cover that had gone soft at the corners from 40 years of being handled, and a spine that had been retaped at some point with a strip of brown packing tape that had itself gone brittle and half loose. My father kept it in the top drawer of the workbench in the equipment barn, and after he passed in 2009, I found it there, and I put it in a cedar chest in the house. And I told myself I would go through it properly when I had the time, and then I did not have the time for 4 years, and then I did not make the time for 6 more, and then it was 2019 and 240 hens were out in my fog, and I went to the cedar chest that same Tuesday evening, after I had fed and watered the birds, and I got the notebook out and I sat down under the single bulb in the equipment barn, and I read it. My grandfather was a precise man. His handwriting was small and upright, and he pressed hard enough on the pencil that you could feel the impressions on the back of the page with your thumb. He kept records the way a good farmer keeps records, which is to say he recorded the things that mattered and left out the things that didn't, and reading it was like listening to a man talk who had never learned to waste a word. There were yield observations, planting dates, drainage notes, equipment records. There were prices paid and prices received across 2 decades of farming, in an era when prices moved in ways that could ruin a man between one spring and the next. And then, near the back of the notebook, in a section he had headed simply with the word poultry and underlined it twice, there were 11 pages of notes on laying hens. My grandfather had run a flock of laying hens as part of a mixed operation for most of his farming life, the way most farmers of his generation did, and he had observed those birds with the same precision he brought to everything else. He had noted feed conversion, he had noted cycle lengths, he had noted egg weights and shell quality across the season, and then, on the 3rd page of the poultry section, he had written a single line that he had not only underlined but circled, and next to the circle he had put a question mark, and the line read as follows: End of cycle birds pastured 6 weeks prior, fetch a price the broiler cannot touch. Touch that word. He had underlined it a second time, and next to the question mark he had written, in smaller letters, as though he were talking to himself and not to the page, find the man who knows the why. That was it. That was the whole thing. He had observed something in his flock, something about what happened to a spent-laying hen when you put her on pasture for 6 weeks before you processed her, and he had noted that the resulting bird commanded a price that his broilers couldn't match, and he had not known why. And he had never, as far as I could find in the rest of the notebook, found the man who knew. My father had read this notebook, I'm certain of it, because the packing tape on the spine was his. I recognized it as the same roll he kept on the workbench, which meant he had repaired it, which meant he had handled it enough to need to repair it. But my father had run the farm as a grain and beef operation by the time he took it over, and the laying hens were long gone, and perhaps the note had meant nothing to him in that context, or perhaps he had meant to circle back to it the same way I had meant to circle back to it, and the years had done what years do. I sat under that single bulb for a long time that night. I read the line again. I read the question mark again. And I thought about 240 birds out in a pasture that hadn't been grazed since July, picking at root and stem and whatever the November ground had left in it. And I thought, all right, old man, I'm going to find the why. The investigation was not fast, and I want to be honest about that too, because this story is not a story about a stroke of luck or a dramatic discovery made in a single afternoon. It is a story about 6 weeks of paying attention and the slow accumulation of evidence that patient attention produces when you point it at the right thing. The first thing I did the morning after I read the notebook was I walked the pasture. Not quickly. I walked it the way my grandfather would have walked it, which is the way you walk ground when you are trying to understand it rather than just cross it. I walked it at first light, before the temperature had come up past 34, and I walked the fence lines first, and then the interior, and I watched the birds. 240 hens on 41 acres is not a dense stocking rate. It is light enough that the pasture can sustain them without serious damage if you move them, or at least give them enough room to distribute, which I had done by opening 3 separate paddocks of my interior fencing so they could range between them as they chose. What I noticed was where they were choosing to be. The southeast paddock, which is the lowest ground I have, the ground that stays wet into May in a wet year, had a particular kind of plant growth that I had never paid much attention to because it wasn't ground I worked or grazed heavily. There was a mixture of low sedge and what I believe was a variety of watergrass, and there were insects working in the standing water that collects in the low spots through the fall, and the birds were in that southeast paddock in far greater numbers than the available space would suggest by random distribution. Out of 240 birds, I counted 163 in that one paddock on the second morning, clustered in the low ground, working the wet soil with a focus that looked less like foraging and more like intent. I noted that in a new notebook I had started for the purpose. I began going out twice a day, morning and evening, and writing down where the birds were, what they were doing, and what the weather had done overnight. I also began handling birds every 3 or 4 days, picking one up from each paddock and feeling the keel, the breast muscle, the weight. In the first week there was nothing much to report. The birds were still narrow, still light. The leghorns especially were not birds that put on flesh quickly, under any circumstances. But by the end of the second week, I was noticing something in the birds that worked the southeast paddock most heavily, which was that their breast muscle was beginning to fill. Not dramatically. Not in the way a broiler fills in a week on a high-protein ration. In the way that muscle fills when an animal is working for its food, and the food is exactly right for what the body needs to do the work. There was a density to the flesh that I hadn't expected, and a color to the skin that was different from what I had seen in a commercial laying hen, which tends toward a pale, almost waxy appearance. These birds were beginning to yellow. Not the yellow of a corn-finished broiler, which is a surface color, a fed color. This was a deeper yellow, the yellow that comes into the fat and the skin of a bird that is eating a varied diet with real range in it, the yellow that my grandfather's generation would have simply called the right color and considered no further. I called the county extension office in the 3rd week, not because I expected them to validate what I was seeing, but because I wanted to hear the official version of the argument I was arguing against. The extension agent who called me back was a pleasant fellow, youngish, well-meaning, and he had a clipboard's worth of data on spent layer disposition. He told me the consensus on commercial spent hens was that they were difficult to market at a premium because of texture, because of yield, because of customer perception, and because the economics of processing a spent bird relative to a broiler were unfavorable. He quoted me a price per bird that the regional rendering operation was currently paying, which was 11 cents per bird. He was not unkind. He was simply certain. He said, "I hope it works out for you," and he meant it. And he gave me his email address in case I had further questions. And that was the last I heard from him. I wrote 11 cents per bird in my notebook, and I underlined it, not in anger, but because it was the number I intended to argue with, and I wanted to see it clearly. The processing question was the one I had postponed the longest, and I will tell you why. A spent-laying hen is not a broiler. She does not dress the same way. She does not yield the same way. And she requires, if you are going to sell her at a premium, a processing approach that honors what she is rather than treating her as a failed version of something she was never meant to be. I knew two things going into the 6th week. I knew the birds were ready or close to it because I had been handling them regularly, and the breast muscle and the back fat had come in to a degree that surprised me every time I put my hand on one. And I knew I had to find a processor who would understand what I was bringing him, because the wrong processing approach on a bird like this will destroy what 6 weeks of pasture has built. I had heard of a small poultry processor about 48 miles south of me, a third-generation operation that had been running since the early 1960s on the same site under the same family name, small by any modern standard, maybe 400 birds a day at their peak, but with a reputation for doing things in a particular way that the larger operations had given up on decades ago. The fellow who ran it now was the founder's grandson, and he was in his mid-60s, which meant he had been around birds since before I had. I drove down on a Wednesday, the 3rd Wednesday of November, and I took 6 birds with me in a crate in the bed of the truck, birds I had selected from the southeast paddock that I thought best represented what the flock had become over 6 weeks on that ground. I told him what I had. I told him where they had come from and what I had done with them for 6 weeks and what I thought I was seeing. He listened without much expression, the way a man listens when he is reserving his judgment rather than forming it prematurely. Then he took the crate around to the back, and he opened it, and he pulled out 2 birds, and he held them and looked at them for what felt like a long time. And I did not say anything, because the moment felt like one that shouldn't be interrupted. He pressed the breast muscle with 2 fingers. He held the bird up and looked at the skin. He put the bird down, and he picked up the second one, and he did it again. And then he set the second bird back in the crate, and he looked at me, and he said one word. He said substantial. And then he was quiet again for a moment, and then he said, "I haven't seen a spent bird come in looking like this without a machine finishing her." I asked him what he meant by substantial. He said the back fat and the intermuscular deposit in a bird like this, a bird that has been on good ground with real forage for the right amount of time, is what you'd expect in a heritage breed finished properly, not in a commercial layer at the end of a cycle. He said these birds will cook long and they will give back more than a customer expects. He said the broth off these birds will be something. He was not excitable about it. He said it the way a man says a fact he has verified, flatly, without decoration. I asked him what he could do for me on processing. We worked it out. I told him I wanted them whole, no cutting, packaged simply, and labeled spent hen pasture finished, because that is exactly what they were, and I did not see any reason to be coy about it. He said he could do that. We settled on a price, and I shook his hand, and I drove home with 6 birds in the crate, and the rest of the question waiting to be answered the following week. 6 weeks to the day from when they had come off the trailer, I processed those 240 hens. My yield per bird was not what a broiler gives you, because a laying hen is a different architecture, and you have to make your peace with that. But the finished birds were averaging 4 pounds, 2 ounces dressed, and the skin was that deep yellow I had been watching come in for 3 weeks, and the fat around the cavity and along the back was visible and rich in a way that the processor's grandson had confirmed, and that my grandfather, I believe, had been trying to describe in 11 pages of careful handwriting and 1 circled question. I took those birds to the market on a Saturday in the first week of December, and I want to tell you what that morning looked like, because the telling of it matters to the story. I had 94 birds for sale that first Saturday, because I had held the rest back for the following week's market, and, for a small restaurant account, I had been quietly building a conversation with over the preceding month. I priced them at $14.50 per bird. I am going to let that number sit next to the other number for a moment, which was 11 cents per bird at the rendering plant. I priced them at $14.50 because that was the number the processor's grandson and I had worked backward, from when we discussed what a bird like this was worth to the kind of customer who understood what she was looking at, and because it was a number I could defend in 2 sentences to anyone who questioned it, which was the following 2 sentences. This bird was on pasture for 6 weeks on grass and insects and living ground before she was processed. The broth she makes will fill your kitchen, and the meat will still be on the bone after 3 hours of slow cooking. That was it. That was the whole sales argument, and it was not an argument, it was a description. And on that first Saturday in December, I sold 94 birds by 8:47 in the morning. The market opened at 7. By noon, as I was packing up an empty table, a woman I had sold to at that market for going on 9 years stopped and asked if I would have more the following week. I told her I would have another 90-something birds. She asked if she could put her name on 2 of them. I told her she could. By the time I got home that Saturday afternoon, I had 11 names on a list for the following week's birds, which was a thing that had never happened to me in 11 years of selling at that market. The money, if you want to know the money, because I think you should know the money, because the money is part of what the notebook was trying to tell me. 94 birds at $14.50 is $1,363. My cost basis on those birds was the $40 in gate hardware and water that I had spent the day the barn boss drove away, plus 6 weeks of supplemental feed, which I had kept minimal because the pasture was doing the work and I did not want to override what the pasture was doing, plus my processing cost at the small plant to the south. Total cost to me across the whole 6 weeks for 240 birds, and I have the notebook right here, and I will read you the exact figure, was $412. 240 birds, $412 in. And every bird sold before 9 in the morning on the first Saturday of December at $14.50 each, which over both weekends came to $3,480 gross, minus the $412, which leaves you $3,068 on a load of birds that the rendering plant had an 11-cent per bird opinion of. I am not telling you this to boast. I am telling you this because my grandfather circled a line in a notebook and put a question mark next to it, and wrote, "Find the man who knows the why," and I think he would have wanted to know the number. I think the number would have mattered to him, not for what it meant to a bank account, but for what it meant to the argument he was making in 11 pages of small, precise handwriting that nobody had answered for 68 years. The neighbor who drives the 2-clean truck came by the following Tuesday, which would have been the second Tuesday of December, and I was at the east gate pulling some hardware that needed replacing, and he slowed and rolled his window down the way he does when he has something to say that he hasn't quite decided how to say. He had heard about the market Saturday, because in a town of this size, the market is not a private event, and by noon of that Saturday, the version of the story at the diner had grown in the way stories grow, and by the following Tuesday, he had apparently heard a version that was accurate enough in its broad outline to require him to stop his truck at my gate. He looked out over the pasture, which was empty now, the birds processed and sold and the ground resting. He looked at it for a moment and he said, "I heard you moved some chickens." I told him I had. He looked at the pasture again and he said, "They were layer hens?" I told him they were. He was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he does when he is recalculating something he had already calculated and doesn't enjoy recalculating. He said, "Huh." And then he said, "That ground held them all right for November." I told him it had. He nodded once, slowly, looked down the fence line, and then he rolled his window up and he drove on. That was it. That was the whole exchange. And if you know this kind of neighbor and this kind of country, you understand that what he said was a concession, and that the concession was genuine, and that it was worth more to me than an argument I could have won out loud. I drove back to the house, and I sat at the kitchen table, and my wife looked up from what she was doing, and she asked how much ground I was thinking about for next spring. I told her I was thinking about the southeast paddock specifically, and maybe opening the conversation with 2 or 3 barn operations about their spent flocks come next October, because the southeast paddock alone could carry 400 birds for 6 weeks without strain, and 400 birds at the numbers I had just run was a conversation worth having with myself before I had it with anyone else. She listened without interrupting, the way she does, and then she asked the question she always asks when I am describing something I have already decided, which was, how many birds are we talking about for the whole season? I told her I thought 400 in October and perhaps another 200 in August, if I could source a mid-cycle spent flock from a different operation, because the August pasture is different from the November pasture, and I wanted to know what the August ground would give a bird that had a full 9 weeks on it instead of 6. She wrote the number down on the paper she keeps by the sink. She didn't say anything else about it. That is how decisions get made in this house. You say the number out loud and she writes it down, and that is the decision. I have thought a lot in the months since that December about what my grandfather was trying to understand when he circled that line and put the question mark next to it. He was a man who had made a precise observation, the way a good farmer does, which is to say, he had noticed a thing that the market was telling him before the market had a language for it. What he observed was that a spent-laying hen, a bird that every commercial logic of his era told him was at the end of her value, was not at the end of her value at all. She was at the beginning of a different kind of value if you gave her the right ground and the right time and the patience to let her find what the ground had for her. The 6 weeks on pasture was not a rescue. It was not a rehabilitation in any sentimental sense. It was a finishing in the precise agricultural meaning of the word, which is the period in which an animal is given the conditions to express the full potential of what she was born to be. A laying hen is not built for speed. She is not built for the 8 to 10 week conversion of a broiler. She is built for time. She is built for slow work and deep foraging, and the kind of varied diet that a good pasture in late fall, with its insects and its grasses, and its wet ground sedge, and its cooling weather root systems working hard before frost, can provide in a way that a controlled feed environment simply cannot replicate. The fat she puts on is different because the diet is different. The muscle she builds is different because the activity is different. The broth she produces is different because both of those things are different. And the customer who has ever made a proper broth from a properly finished spent hen knows this the way she knows it in her hands and in her kitchen and in the smell that comes off the pot, which is a knowledge that no extension agent's clipboard can produce or disprove. My grandfather called it a price the broiler cannot touch, and he was right. And he was right 68 years before I proved it with 94 birds on a December Saturday. And the reason he was right is the same reason the birds clustered in my southeast paddock were right to cluster there. They were paying attention to what the ground had. They knew something before I did. I had to learn to read what they already knew, which is a thing my grandfather would have recognized immediately because he wrote it down in a different form in that notebook, in the section before the poultry section, where he was writing about his beef cattle in the early 1960s. He wrote, "The animal that works its feed will always tell you more about the ground than the ground will tell you directly." I read that line a dozen times the winter after that December market. I wrote it in my own notebook. I have it here. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That is a thing my grandfather said to my father, and my father said it to me, and I have said it to myself on a number of Tuesday mornings when the fog was sitting low, and the logic of what I was doing was not yet visible to anyone but me and the birds working the wet ground. The field doesn't care who believes in it. It only cares whether you are paying attention, whether you stayed long enough to see what it was trying to show you, whether you had the patience to let an 11-cent bird become a $14.50 bird by the simple, unhurried application of 6 weeks and 41 acres of ground that nobody else wanted to use in November. That is the whole lesson. That is what the circled line was trying to say. And I want to tell you, if you are out there with a piece of ground that someone has told you is done, or a bird or an animal or a method or a tool that someone in a clean truck or a clean Carhartt with a number on a clipboard has looked at and told you has no value left in it, I want you to sit with that assessment for a moment, and then I want you to ask yourself whether the person delivering it stayed long enough to know what they were looking at. Because in my experience, and I have 61 years of this ground under me, the things that get written off the fastest are very often the things that reward the longest attention. The renderer's price is not the farmer's price. It never was. And if you've got your own load of overlooked birds, your own piece of low ground that the neighbor has already written a number on, your own circled line in an old notebook that nobody answered yet, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below. Leave it there. Tell me what you're sitting on and what question you haven't answered yet. And if this is a place you want to keep coming back to, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get where we're going. And the getting there is the whole point.